The boy hung from the fence like something forgotten. His wrists were tied with frayed rope to the top rail, arms stretched above his head, toes barely scraping the dirt below. His shirt had been torn open down the front, exposing sunburned skin and the sharp ridge of his ribs. He couldn't have been more than 9 years old. He didn't cry. He didn't call out. He just hung there in the midday heat, head tilted forward, dark hair falling across his face. Ayanna saw him from the ridge. She had been tracking a wounded pronghorn for 3 miles, moving quietly through the tall grass with her rifle slung across her back and her eyes on the blood trail. But when she crested the hill and looked down into the valley, the blood didn't matter anymore. The fence stood alone in the middle of nowhere, a stretch of weathered wood posts and sagging wire that marked the edge of what used to be a cattle ranch. The house was gone. The barn was a blackened shell. All that remained was the fence and the boy tied to it. Ayanna froze. She had lived alone for 6 years, ever since the soldiers came and burned her village to ash. She had learned to stay invisible, to move through the land like a shadow, to take what she needed and leave no trace. She didn't stop for strangers. She didn't ask questions. She survived. But the boy hung there and she couldn't look away. She moved down the ridge slowly, her hand resting on the knife at her belt. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke and something else. Something sour, like fear, left too long in the sun. As she got closer, she could see the bruises on his arms, the dried blood on his knuckles, the way his chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. He didn't look up when she approached. "Don't," he whispered. His voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "Don't. Look there." Ayanna stopped a few feet away. She followed his gaze to the ground beside the fence, where the dirt was darker, stained. A woman's shawl lay crumpled in the dust, torn and bloodied. Beside it a man's hat, and farther out, near the edge of the burned barn, 2 shallow mounds of earth, covered with stones. The boy's eyes lifted to hers for the first time. They were gray, pale as winter sky, and full of something that made her chest tighten. "They made me watch," he said. Ayanna didn't ask who they were. She didn't need to. She stepped forward and cut the ropes with one clean motion. The boy collapsed into her arms, his weight almost nothing, his skin burning with fever. She lowered him to the ground and knelt beside him, her hands moving quickly over his wrists, checking for broken bones, checking for worse. "Who did this?" she asked. He didn't answer. He just stared at the graves. Ayanna looked around the valley. The ranch had been gutted, deliberately, methodically. The barn doors had been blown off their hinges. The corral fence was trampled. Hoofprints circled the property like vultures. She counted at least 6 riders, maybe more. They had come in fast, done their work, and left. But they had left the boy. That was the part that didn't make sense. Men who burned ranches didn't leave witnesses. Men who tied children to fences and made them watch didn't walk away without finishing the job, unless they wanted someone to find him, unless they wanted to send a message. Ayanna touched the boy's shoulder, and he flinched. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said. He looked at her then, really looked at her. His eyes moved over her face, her braided hair, the beadwork on her leather vest, the rifle on her back. He didn't speak, but something in his expression shifted. Fear, maybe, or recognition, or both. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. Then barely a whisper. Caleb. Caleb, she repeated. She glanced at the graves again. Your parents. He nodded. Who were the men? Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked away, his hands curling into fists against the dirt. They said my father stole from them, he said. They said he owed a debt. They said, his voice broke. They said he was a traitor. Ayanna's blood went cold. She knew that word. She had heard it before, 6 years ago, when the soldiers came to her village with torches and rifles. They had called her people traitors too. They had said the land belonged to the Union now, that anyone who resisted was an enemy. They had burned everything, and they had left no one alive, except her. She had been 16 then, hiding in the river with water up to her chin, watching the smoke rise into the sky. She had stayed there until the screaming stopped, until the soldiers rode away, until the silence was so heavy she thought she might drown in it. She had survived because she had been too afraid to move. And now, here was this boy, tied to a fence, forced to watch the same thing she had seen. Left alive for the same reason she had been left alive. Because someone wanted them to remember. Ayanna stood slowly, her hand tightening around the hilt of her knife. She scanned the horizon, looking for movement, for dust, for any sign that the riders might return. But the valley was empty, silent. "Can you walk?" she asked. Caleb tried to push himself up, but his legs buckled. Ayanna caught him before he fell. "I'll carry you," she said. "No!" "You'll die if you stay here." He looked at her, his eyes wide and desperate. "Where will you take me?" Ayanna didn't have an answer. She lived in a small canyon 15 miles north, a place hidden by rocks and juniper trees, a place no one knew about. She had no supplies for a child, no medicine, no extra food. She had been alone for 6 years, and she had learned to like it that way. But the boy was staring at her, and the graves were behind him, and the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon. She adjusted her rifle and lifted him onto her back. "Somewhere safe," she said. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even a plan. But it was the only answer she had. As she carried him up the ridge, Caleb's head rested against her shoulder, and he whispered something so quiet, she almost didn't hear it. "Thank you." Ayanna didn't reply. She just kept walking, her eyes on the trail ahead, her mind already working through the supplies she would need, the distance they would have to cover, the questions she didn't want to ask. But one thought kept circling back, sharp and cold as a blade. She had seen that fence before. She had seen that ranch before. 6 years ago, when the soldiers came through, they had stopped there for water. She had been hiding in the rocks above the valley, watching them from a distance. She had seen the family, 2 adults, a small boy, standing in the yard while the soldiers drank from their well, and she had done nothing. She had watched them ride away. She had told herself it wasn't her fight. She had told herself she couldn't save everyone. And now the boy from that ranch was on her back, barely breathing, and the graves of his parents were cooling in the dirt behind them. Ayanna's throat tightened. She hadn't saved them then, but maybe, just maybe, she could save him now. Ayanna's canyon was a wound in the earth, narrow, deep, and hidden by a shelf of red rock that jutted out like a broken rib. A thin stream ran through the bottom, cold and clear, fed by snowmelt from the mountains. She had built her shelter into the canyon wall, a small structure of stacked stone and salvaged timber that blended into the rock face. From a distance, it was invisible. She laid Caleb on a pile of furs near the fire pit and covered him with a wool blanket. His fever had worsened during the journey, and his skin was slick with sweat. She heated water over the fire, tore strips from an old shirt, and pressed the damp cloth to his forehead. He didn't wake. For 3 days, Ayanna kept the fire low and the shelter quiet. She boiled roots for broth, cleaned his wounds with yarrow paste, and watched his chest rise and fall in the dim light. She didn't know if he would survive. She didn't know if she wanted him to. Not because she didn't care, but because if he lived, she would have to tell him the truth. On the 4th morning, Caleb opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling for a long time, his expression blank, as if he were trying to remember where he was. Then his gaze found Ayanna, sitting cross-legged by the fire, sharpening her knife. "You're awake," she said. He didn't answer. He just looked at her, then at the walls, then at the furs beneath him. His fingers moved slowly over the blanket, testing its weight, its reality. "Where am I?" he asked finally. "My home." "Where's that?" "Far enough." Caleb sat up slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at the bruises on his ribs. He looked down at his bandaged wrists, then at the bowl of broth sitting beside him. "You should eat," Ayanna said. He picked up the bowl and drank without speaking. When he finished, he set it down and stared at the fire. "Why did you help me?" he asked. Ayanna didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes on the blade in her hands, turning it slowly in the light. "I don't know," she said. "You could have left me there." "Yes, but you didn't." "No." Caleb looked at her then, his gray eyes steady and searching. "Because you felt sorry for me." Ayanna stopped sharpening the knife. She looked up at him, and for a moment, she saw herself, 6 years ago, crouched in the river, watching the smoke rise, telling herself that survival was enough. "No," she said quietly, "because I owed you." Caleb frowned. "You don't know me. I know your ranch." The boy went still. His hands tightened around the edge of the blanket. "What?" he whispered. Ayanna set the knife down and stood. She walked to the entrance of the shelter and looked out at the canyon, her back to him. "6 years ago," she said, "soldiers came through this territory. They burned my village, killed my family. I was hiding in the rocks watching. I saw them ride south after. They stopped at a ranch in the valley." "Your ranch." Caleb's breathing quickened. "I saw your parents," Ayanna continued. "I saw you. You were small, maybe 3 years old. You were standing in the yard holding your mother's hand. The soldiers took water from your well. They talked to your father. Then they rode away." She turned to face him. "I thought about warning you," she said. "I thought about riding down and telling your family that the soldiers were coming back, but I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my fight. I told myself I had to survive." Caleb stared at her, his face pale. "So I left," Ayanna said. "I moved north. I built this place. And I told myself I had made the right choice." "But you didn't," Caleb whispered. "No." The boy's hands trembled. "They came back." "Yes." "They burned everything." "Yes." "They killed my parents." Ayanna nodded slowly. "And I wasn't there to stop it." Caleb stood abruptly. the blanket falling from his shoulders. His eyes were wide, his chest heaving. "You could have saved them," he said. "Maybe. You could have warned us. Yes, but you didn't." His voice cracked. "You let them die." Ayanna didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She just stood there, her hands at her sides, and let the words land. "I did," she said. Caleb's face twisted with anger, with grief, with something raw and jagged. He took a step toward her, his fists clenched. "Then why did you save me?" he shouted. "Why did you bring me here? Why?" His voice broke, and suddenly he wasn't shouting anymore. He was just a boy, standing in the middle of a canyon, shaking. "Why didn't you just leave me there?" Ayanna closed the distance between them slowly. She knelt in front of him, her eyes level with his. "Because I can't bring them back," she said quietly. "But I can keep you alive." Caleb's jaw tightened. Tears streaked his face, but he didn't wipe them away. "That doesn't make it better," he said. "I know. It doesn't change what you did. I know. Then why should I stay here?" Caleb's voice was shaking. "Why should I trust you?" Ayanna reached into her vest and pulled out something small and worn. She held it out to him. It was a wooden carving, a small horse, no bigger than her palm, smooth and weathered with age. Caleb stared at it. His breath caught. "That's... your father made it," Ayanna said. "6 years ago, when the soldiers stopped at your ranch. I was watching from the ridge. Your father was sitting on the porch carving. He gave it to you. You dropped it in the dirt when your mother called you inside." Caleb took the carving with trembling hands. He turned it over, his fingers tracing the worn edges. "I went back that night," Ayanna said, "after the soldiers left. I found it in the yard. I told myself I was going to return it, but I never did." Caleb looked up at her, his eyes red and raw. "I've carried it for 6 years," Ayanna said. "Every day. A reminder of what I didn't do." The boy's hands closed around the carving. He didn't speak. He just stood there, holding the only piece of his father he had left. "You don't have to trust me," Ayanna said. "You don't have to forgive me. But if you stay, I'll teach you how to survive. I'll teach you how to fight. And when you're strong enough, you can decide what to do next." Caleb stared at her for a long time. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. Ayanna stood and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Good," she said. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust. And somewhere in the distance, a rider stopped on a ridge, watching the canyon below. The rider came at dawn. Ayanna saw him before she heard him. A dark shape moving along the ridge, silhouetted against the pale morning sky. He sat his horse, like a man who had ridden through, worse, slow and deliberate, scanning the canyon below. She woke Caleb with a hand over his mouth. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "Don't move." His eyes went wide, but he nodded. Ayanna grabbed her rifle and crawled to the entrance of the shelter, pressing herself flat against the rock. She watched the rider through a crack in the stone, her finger resting on the trigger. He was alone. That was the first thing she noticed. The second was the badge pinned to his vest. A lawman. He rode down into the canyon slowly, his eyes moving over the rocks, the stream, the juniper trees. He wasn't searching randomly. He knew where he was going. Ayanna's stomach tightened. The man stopped near the stream and dismounted. He crouched by the water, ran his fingers through the dirt, then stood and looked directly at the canyon wall, at her shelter. "I know you're in there," he called out. His voice was rough, like gravel scraped over metal. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Ayanna didn't move. She kept her rifle aimed at his chest, her breathing slow and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man continued. "I'm here about the boy." Caleb shifted behind her, and Ayanna pressed a hand back, silencing him. The lawman stepped closer to the rocks. He was older than she expected, maybe 50, with a weathered face and gray in his beard. He wore a dusty coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. "Name's Dalton," he said. "Sheriff Dalton. I'm looking for a boy, about 9 years old, dark hair, gray eyes. Last seen tied to a fence near the old Brennan ranch." Ayanna's blood turned cold. Brennan. That was Caleb's family name. "The Brennans were traitors," Dalton continued, his tone flat. "They harbored Union deserters during the war, sold supplies to rebel sympathizers. The law finally caught up with them." Ayanna's jaw tightened. She had heard that story before. It was the same story the soldiers had told about her village. The same excuse they used to justify burning homes and killing families. "The boy's wanted for questioning," Dalton said. "He's a witness, and anyone hiding him is committing a crime." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "So if you've got him in there, you'd best send him out now." Ayanna's grip tightened on the rifle. She didn't answer. Dalton sighed and adjusted his hat. "Look, I get it. You don't trust lawmen. Hell, I wouldn't either if I were you. But this ain't about trust. This is about the law. The law," Ayanna said quietly, her voice carrying across the canyon, "didn't stop you from burning his home." Dalton went still. He turned toward the sound of her voice, his eyes narrowing. "So you do have him," he said. Ayanna didn't reply. Dalton took a step forward. "Listen to me. I don't know who you are and I don't care, but that boy is evidence. He saw something he wasn't supposed to see, and now people want him gone. If you hand him over, I can protect him. I can put him in a safe house. But if you keep him here, they'll come for him, and they won't stop with just him." "Who's they?" Ayanna asked. Dalton hesitated. For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Uncertainty, maybe, or regret. "Men with money," he said finally. "Men with power. Men who don't like loose ends." "Men like you." Dalton's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to keep him alive. By turning him over to the people who killed his parents. By following the law." Ayanna laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "The law didn't save my people. It won't save him." Dalton's hand moved to the pistol at his hip, but he didn't draw. He just stood there, his eyes locked on the rocks, his voice low and steady. "I'm giving you one chance," he said. "Send the boy out, and I'll forget I saw you. Keep him, and I'll come back with enough men to dig you out." Ayanna's finger tightened on the trigger. "Come back," she said, "and I'll make sure you don't leave." Dalton stared at the canyon wall for a long moment. Then slowly, he turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted in one smooth motion and looked over his shoulder. "3 days," he said. "That's all you've got." He rode out of the canyon without another word. Ayanna waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before lowering her rifle. She turned back to Caleb, who was sitting against the wall, his face pale and his hands shaking. "They're coming for me," he whispered. "Yes. What do we do?" Ayana looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to the back of the shelter where she kept her supplies. She pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and set it on the ground between them. "We get ready," she said. Caleb stared at the bundle. "For what?" Ayana unwrapped the cloth, revealing a pistol, a box of ammunition, and a knife with a bone handle. "For war," she said. "So let me ask you something. If you were Ayana, would you have stayed? Would you have taught that boy to fight, knowing men with badges and guns were coming? Or would you have slipped away in the night and left him to whatever mercy the law might offer? Think about that. And if you're still with me, tap subscribe so you don't miss how this ends." The canyon was quiet in the days that followed. Ayana didn't wait for Dalton to return. She moved through the shelter with purpose, packing supplies, checking ammunition, teaching Caleb how to load a rifle without fumbling. He was clumsy at first, his hands too small, his fingers unsure. But he learned quickly. She showed him how to track movement in the dirt, how to read the wind, how to move through the rocks without making a sound. She taught him the things her father had taught her, the things that had kept her alive when everyone else had died. And at night, when the fire burned low, they sat in silence. It was on the third night that Caleb finally spoke. "Why do you live alone?" he asked. Ayana looked up from the knife she was sharpening. "Because it's easier." "Easier than what?" "Than caring." Caleb stared at the fire. "Do you care about me?" Ayana paused. She set the knife down and looked at him. Really looked at him. His face was thinner now, his eyes older than they should have been. He looked like she had looked 6 years ago. "Yes," she said quietly. Caleb's throat worked. "Then why didn't you care about my parents?" Ayana didn't flinch. She held his gaze. "Because I was afraid," she said. "Because I thought survival was the only thing that mattered. Because I told myself that saving one person, me, was enough. And now I know better." Caleb looked away. "My father used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are." Ayana's chest tightened. He was right. He also said that people who run from their mistakes die running. Ayana closed her eyes. He was right about that too. They sat in silence for a while. Then Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden horse she had given him. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers tracing the worn edges. "I remember this," he said. "I remember my father carving it. He told me it was a gift. He said it would protect me." "Did it?" Ayana asked. Caleb shook his head. "No, but you did." Ayana looked at him, and something in her chest cracked. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm going to keep protecting you," she said, "no matter what happens." Caleb looked up at her, his eyes wet. "Promise. Promise." He nodded slowly, then leaned against her, and, for the first time since she had found him, tied to that fence, he cried. Not the silent, shaking kind of crying, but the deep, gasping kind that comes from a place too deep to name. Ayana held him. She didn't speak. She didn't try to stop him. She just let him break, the way she had never let herself break. And when the tears finally stopped, Caleb pulled back and wiped his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Don't be," Ayana said, Grief is just love with nowhere to go. Caleb looked at her, his expression soft and raw. Who told you that? My mother. Where is she now? Gone. Caleb nodded slowly. Then he reached out and took Ayana's hand. I'm glad I'm not alone, he said. Ayana squeezed his hand. So am I. The fire crackled between them, casting long shadows on the canyon walls. And outside, the wind carried the sound of hoofbeats, distant but growing closer. They came at dawn on the fourth day. Ayana heard them before she saw them. 8 riders, maybe more, moving through the canyon like a slow-moving storm. She woke Caleb and handed him the pistol. Stay behind the rocks, she said. Don't shoot unless I tell you. He nodded, his face pale but steady. Ayana took her rifle and moved to the entrance of the shelter. She pressed herself against the stone and watched the riders descend into the canyon. Dalton was at the front, his badge glinting in the early light. Behind him were men she recognized, hired guns, drifters, the kind of men who did dirty work for clean money. They stopped near the stream. This is your last chance, Dalton called out. Send the boy out, and no one gets hurt. Ayana didn't answer. Dalton sighed and dismounted. He gestured to the men behind him, and they spread out, circling the canyon, rifles raised. I didn't want it to come to this, Dalton said. Then leave, Ayana called back. Can't do that. Then you'll die here. Dalton laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You really think you can take all of us? No, Ayana said. But I don't have to. Dalton frowned. What? A voice cut through the canyon, sharp and clear. That's far enough, Dalton. The sheriff spun around, his hand going to his pistol. A man stood on the ridge above, silhouetted against the rising sun. He was older, weathered, with a rifle slung across his back. Behind him, 5 more men emerged from the rocks. Ranchers, farmers, men with sun-darkened skin and hard eyes. One of them was missing an arm. Another walked with a limp. But they all carried rifles, and they all had them trained on Dalton's men. Who the hell are you? Dalton demanded. The man on the ridge stepped forward. Name's Holt. I worked the Brennan Ranch 20 years back. Caleb's father saved my life during a stampede. So when I heard you were hunting his boy, I figured it was time to return the favor. Another man spoke up. I knew the Brennans, too. They never turned away a man in need. Never asked questions. Just gave food and work. And I owe them for sheltering my family during the war, a third man said. So if you want the boy, you'll have to go through us. Dalton's jaw tightened. He looked around at his men, then back at the ridge. The odds had shifted. Fast. This is the law, Dalton said. The law, Holt said quietly, doesn't burn innocent families and call it justice. Dalton's hand moved to his pistol, but Holt's rifle swung toward him. Don't, Holt said. You've done enough. For a long moment, no one moved. The canyon was silent except for the wind and the soft trickle of the stream. Then slowly, Dalton lowered his hand. This isn't over, he said. Yes, Holt replied. It is. Dalton stared at him, his face hard. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode out of the canyon. His men followed, their eyes on the ridge, their hands away from their guns. When the last rider disappeared, Holt lowered his rifle and looked down at Ayana. You all right down there? He called. Ayana stepped out of the shelter, her rifle still in her hands. Yes. Holt nodded. The boy. Caleb emerged from the rocks, his pistol lowered. He looked up at the men on the ridge, his eyes wide. "Thank you," he said. Holt smiled. "Your father would have done the same." The men left soon after, disappearing into the hills as quietly as they had come. Ayanna and Caleb stood by the stream, watching the dust settle. "They came for you," Ayanna said quietly. "They came for him," Caleb replied, looking up at her. "But they stayed for you." Ayanna didn't answer. She just placed a hand on his shoulder. Over the weeks that followed, the canyon became something it had never been before. A home. Caleb helped her mend fences, plant seeds, haul water from the stream. He grew stronger, taller, his hands steady and sure. And at night, they sat by the fire and told stories, stories about the people they had lost and the people they had saved. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, Caleb carved something into a piece of wood. When he finished, he handed it to Ayanna. It was a small bird, rough and uneven, but unmistakable. "My father taught me," Caleb said. "Now I'm teaching you." Ayanna took the carving and turned it over in her hands. She looked at the boy, no longer trembling, no longer broken, and she smiled. "Thank you," she said. Years later, when Caleb was grown and the canyon was filled with the sound of children playing, he would tell them the story of the woman who found him tied to a fence. He would tell them about the graves, the riders, the men who came to help. And he would tell them that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about staying when it would be easier to run. And Ayanna, sitting by the fire with silver in her hair, would hold the wooden bird in her hands and remember the day she stopped running, the day she chose to stay.